Welcome. This presentation is available for MCLE self-study credit. If you would like to receive credit, you must take 3 actions. First, click Show More text below on our YouTube page. The text will expand and show a link to download the handout materials. Once you finish watching this presentation, please click the quiz link to receive self-study credit. Once the quiz is successfully completed, you will receive a certificate via email within 72 hours. We hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar presentation, The Abundance Agenda and Moving California Forward. My name is Joanna Barron and I am the Executive Vice President of ADR Services, Inc. If this is your first time attending one of our complimentary CLE programs, a special welcome to you. For those of you who have joined us before, thank you for coming back. At ADR Services, Inc., our mission has always been to provide the highest level of quality, integrity, and efficiency in dispute resolution services. Now, celebrating 31 years as a trusted leader in the field, we are proud to offer an exceptional panel of mediators, arbitrators, referees, and private judges backed by superior case management to support that mission. As a California State Bar certified CLE provider, we are committed to delivering high caliber programs on a wide range of civil law topics, always featuring our experienced and knowledgeable panelists, and always free of charge. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to Gideon Kracov for assembling today's distinguished panel for this important discussion on California's abundance agenda, its impact on our economy, policy reform, and dispute resolution. And a thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us. With that, I will turn the program back over to Katie Jones to get us started.
Thanks so much, Joanna. Before we go into the program, I have just a little bit of housekeeping information for everybody. First and foremost, you can access the handout materials in your final reminder from Zoom that you received just about an hour ago. They're also available on our website, and I will post a copy in the handout in the chat. That handout consists of several further reading articles from our panelists and other references for learning more about the topic. If you are a lawyer in the audience or looking for CLE credit, this program does provide 1.5 hours of CLE credit. We'll send your CLE certificates within the next week. So look out for that in email. If you don't see it, check your spam folder just in case it got caught in one of your filters. The program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel within the next 3 to 4 weeks. Throughout the program, you can enable closed captions at the bottom of your screen by clicking the Show Captions button. If you have any questions, you're welcome to submit them in the Q&A, but I will say that we likely will not have time to address audience questions this afternoon. I will take a note of them and provide them to our panelists for any follow-up afterwards. And finally, if you have any other questions or need assistance, please contact ADR Services, Inc., either by calling one of our offices or reaching out to mcle@adrservices.com. Now, without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to hand it over to Gideon Kracov, who is going to introduce our fabulous panel and wonderful presentation today. Gideon.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Joanna Barron. My name is Gideon Kracov. I'm a full-time mediator at ADR Services, Inc., based in Los Angeles. Lawyers and clients hire me to help settle their real estate, civil, and environmental cases, to reduce reactivity between the sides that occurs in lawsuits and conflicts, to help the parties focus on common interests instead of litigation positions. I'm the former California governor's appointee to both the Air Resources Board and the South Coast Air Quality Management District, and I teach land use law and dispute resolution on the faculty at Loyola Law School. Welcome to the Abundance Agenda and Moving California Forward. If you're passionate about building what California needs, improving political governance, and engaging in current affairs, this program is for you. We at ADR Services want to thank our co-sponsors, Professor Ethan Elkind and my alma mater, the UC Berkeley Law Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, the Association for Conflict Resolution, Environment, and Public Policy Section, California Forward, and Kearns and West. And of course, none of the sponsors today endorse any particular viewpoint that's expressed. And to our gracious co-sponsor and my host, where I am recording today from San Francisco, the law firm of Hanson Bridget, with my friends and big Abundance fans, Sean Herman, Allison Schutte, and Dana Dean. Let's meet our superstar panel for the hour and one half that we have today. Each of them will speak for a bit. Then we're going to have a robust, interactive discussion. Please also note there's a terrific compilation of materials linked with your registration email. Ezra Klein is one of the preeminent public intellectuals and thought leaders in America. He's a New York Times columnist and host of the Ezra Klein Show podcast, co-founder of Vox, and its former editor-at-large. Ezra's written 2 books. Why We're Polarized, published in 2020, explains how polarized political identities and political institutions are driving our system toward crisis. And Abundance, co-written with Derek Thompson, published in March 2025. Given Ezra's enormous body of work, there is so much to talk about. But if it's okay, with your permission, we're going to today, for the most part, focus on abundance. Ezra also is, for full disclosure, my brother. Our family is watching now. So proud. I think the word in Yiddish is felling. Kate Gordon is a lawyer, urban planner, and leader in the green jobs movement. She served as senior advisor to Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm at the United States Department of Energy during the Biden administration. She previously was appointed by Governor Newsom to lead his Office of Planning and Research. She currently serves as CEO of California Forward, a multi-partisan nonprofit focused on building a new California economy. It convenes business, community, government, regional stakeholders, labor, and philanthropy to build fiscal and energy resilience for our state. Each year, it hosts its flagship Economics Summit, coming up October 21st in Stockton. Please join Kate there. She's a bit under the weather today, so hopefully adrenaline is going to carry her through. Finally, Sharif Ebrahim. Sharif is managing principal of Kearns West. He implements multidisciplinary collaboration and mediation programs on complex water, energy infrastructure, and land use projects. He works with everyone: local, state, federal agencies, trade associations, tribes, neighbors, Fortune 500 industry. Sharif gives parties the tools and neutral process to persuade, reduce polarization, and resolve disputes. Now, let me just take a couple minutes, maybe 5 minutes, to set the stage. Have you read Ezra's book, Abundance, arguing California must streamline housing and infrastructure permitting to build the affordable green economy that we need? The book is divided into 5 chapters. First, Grow, which discusses the conflict between California's restrictive zoning rules and the need for more abundant housing. Our state's housing demand requires an estimated 180,000 new units a year. Ezra and his co-author challenge voters in blue states like California, saying they too often are symbolically liberal but operationally conservative. Ezra says of California, too many things have gone wrong: high-speed rail, homelessness, housing affordability, catastrophic wildfires. Abundance asks why. Chapter 2, Build, recognizes that to meet the threat of climate change, we need to remake the world we have built. That the answer to the climate crisis is not to shrink our ambition or shrink demand for housing, industry, or immigration, but instead to grow supply, an abundance of renewable energy to power artificial intelligence, grid upgrades, battery and water storage, manufacturing, relentless innovation. Instead, however, our laws and agencies and habits are too often paralyzed by process and not guided by outcomes. They are better designed to block green construction than allow it. For example, President Biden's infrastructure bill had $7.5 billion to build a national network of 800,000 electric car chargers. But 2 years later, only 7 chargers were up and running. We need a liberalism that builds. Chapter 3 is entitled Govern. Government has a key role in leadership and funding, but when it adds too many environmental, labor, or other goals and rules, projects collapse under their own weight. Government needs to justify itself not by the rules it follows, but by the outcomes it delivers. Chapter 4, Invent, stresses the need for government intervention in new technology to help create markets. Examples include the internet, the space program, to the mRNA vaccines and Operation Warp Speed. We've been very successful here in California, for example, with advanced market commitments and funding and regulatory carrots for electric vehicles. Finally, Chapter 5, Deploy, emphasizes we cannot be afraid of growth or allergic to public-private partnerships. Government should be a bottleneck detective, Ezra writes, removing restrictions that should not exist or creating new programs that don't exist but should. Our leaders, politics, and priorities should be focused on what is scarce that should be abundant, what is difficult to build that should be easy, what inventions do we need? Hope that was an okay summary, Ezra. Folks, please buy the book. It's way better than my summary. Now, to conclude with the introduction, abundance has resonated big time. It's a smash #1 New York Times bestseller, creating a new vocabulary for elected officials, a movement. It's been cited as a must-read blueprint for reforming government by President Obama. And from everyone, Governor Newsom, to local officials like San Jose's so-called abundance mayor, Matt Mahan. There's now a bipartisan abundance caucus in the U.S. Congress. It's been cited as a major influence internationally. Canada, the UK, in Australia, it's been called a sensation. The LA Times calls it a cause célèbre. And it's not just a book on the shelf. It was so persuasive that it helped lead to major reform in California just 4 months after publication. In June this year, our state overhauled the California Environmental Quality Act of 1970, the state's landmark law that requires government officials to consider the environmental impact of public or private development. The legislature scaled back the law dramatically, exempting most urban housing developments along with advanced manufacturing hubs. In doing so, many say they overcame a once inviolable alliance of construction unions, environmentalists, and homeowners. The largest reform in generations. Governor Newsom shouted out Ezra Klein at the signing press conference for focusing state leaders on boosting supply and rejecting a scarcity mindset. Many say abundance offers a path forward for the Democratic Party to earn back voters' confidence. UC Berkeley now has an Abundance Accelerator Lab. Researching for this webinar, I even learned of an Abundance Coachella in Washington, D.C. So, Ezra defines abundance as a state where there's enough of what we need to create better lives, to focus on the building blocks of the future, housing, transportation, energy, health, and on the institutions and people that must build and invent that future. So with that long introduction, let's begin. Welcome, Ezra. You write a lot about California, and Abundance uses several examples of California policy, such as high-speed rail, to make its arguments. Just to start here, can you talk a little bit about your connection to California and why you care so much about our state?
Of course. So thank you to Gideon for the overly kind introduction. I mean, when I hear it all said like that, it really sounds like this is going great. No, there's no dissension, no arguments. We're just steamrolling to victory here. And I'm on a chair that just is breaking. So give me 1 second. Apologies. So the first thing to just say is that I am Californian. Sorry, this is embarrassing. I'm going to get a different chair here. I just had the cushion fall off. We have a scarcity of good chairs where I'm sitting. The first thing to say is I'm Californian. I was born in Irvine, California. I grew up in California. I'm a product of our public schools, of the UC system. I went to UC Santa Cruz and then to UCLA. And then when I was 21, I moved to Washington, D.C. and became a political journalist. And I spent 14 years in D.C. And when you're in D.C., covering national politics, you become naturally focused on the question of why is it so hard to get things done in a polarized political system? And that's the subject really of my first book, Why We're Polarized. Why do conversations that often begin in a place of positive sum policy disagreement and imagination? The number of times I sat in a room with members of the right and the left agreeing on ways you can make the healthcare system or the tax code better from both perspectives was numerous. And then by the end, you have these knockdown, drag-out fights, a war of all against all, Obamacare. What has happened that has made it so hard to solve people's problems nationally? In 2018, I moved with my family back to California, to Oakland first and then San Francisco. And One thing that it was very hard to miss was that California just wasn't doing well. It had become a very different state than the one in which I grew up. I remember having a podcast talking about Orange County, where I grew up, which, the part of it I lived in was middle class. And when we were talking, this was just, I remember somebody on the right, Raihan Salam, the head of the Manhattan Institute, and he was saying, well, that's like Irvine. I mean, unbelievably expensive housing. I remember saying, no, 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 Irvine is, and I went and I looked. Nope, sure enough, it is. It is not a place you can go and comfortably live and move on a middle class salary. And California was losing people. It was particularly losing working class residents. And I began to think about this question. Why, in the places where the people who governed agreed with me, or I agreed with them, were the outcomes not better? Why could you not run for president effectively saying, vote for me, and I'll govern the country like I govern New York, or like I govern California, or like I govern Illinois? You could run for president saying, vote for me, and I'll govern the country the way I govern Texas or Florida. I think that if you want people to trust you, you have to be able to look seriously at your own failures. And a state where it is unaffordable in vast parts of it for people to live there, a state where we were not building enough clean energy to meet our very ambitious clean energy goals, a state where the headline infrastructure project of the past decades had become a punchline in high-speed rail. That was a place, I think, for me at least, to say we need to confront some of our own failures and problems. At the same time, nationally, Democrats were beginning to run into the same problems they'd run into in California. The Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, all these would require building real things in the real world. I used to, Gideon helped get me into politics when I was younger. And one reason I was so excited by California politics was it often felt like we were facing the problems that the rest of the country would face in 10 or 15 years. We were a majority minority state long before that became even a sort of thing anybody in the country was thinking about. And we were facing some of these problems of a sclerotic liberalism before it became something that I think the rest of the nation was thinking about. And so I think good political movements and good political thinking is not a generalized application of principles, but a specific inquiry that then you check if what you are inquiring about generalizes well to other places. And as me and Derek did this work, and I sort of rooted a lot of it in California, I found, yes, what we were finding was resonating in New York, in Massachusetts, in Boston, and ultimately, a little bit to my surprise, in Australia, in the UK, in Germany, in Canada. So California is important to me because I am Californian and I care deeply about what happens in the state that I love. But California is important to the book. California is important to the movement because California is now, as it so often is, 10 or 15 years ahead in the problems it is facing. And so if you're going to believe in a renewal for liberalism elsewhere, and the way I think of abundance is a liberalism that builds, a liberalism able to achieve its goals, then I think you need to prove that in a place like California, you can make it happen there. It's going to be a hell of a lot easier in California than it's going to be nationally, where the government has the filibuster and a million other things that are very hard to get through. So I care about California because I care about California, but we care about California because California is a place where you can see clearly both the pathologies and hopefully the path forward for ideas and outcomes and a future that we care about.
Yeah, so all you Californians in the audience here, it's a lot on our shoulders. So, I've tried to give you the audience an introduction on the 5 chapters in abundance. Take this opportunity if I sort of missed anything about what the book is trying to get across, or let's talk now. It's 6 months after the release of the book. What are your current thoughts on the topic? What have you learned these last 6 months, Ezra?
I've learned a lot. So I just actually came from the Abundance Conference, which was in DC on a week ago Friday. And I try to be focused. You write a book like this, and you can end up, very quickly feeling like you're the Rolling Stones doing reunion tours. It's been whatever it is, 5 or 6 months, and I feel like it would be easy to just go to a million places and say the same thing over and over again. So I try to stay very focused on I think my role is pushing the conversation forward. And the thing I'm already noticing is that I think it would be very easy for this thing that is now getting called abundance, which I've always been a little bit uncomfortable with. Abundance is a word Derek came up with, and it was a word that developed all of the mimetic and intentional energy around the set of ideas. I'd initially called it supply side liberalism or liberalism that builds. And I recognize those are worse names. But what they have that I think has some value is a certain specificity. They begin to define what it is and what it isn't. And I think I've become more focused recently. I'm going to write a piece about this probably for next Sunday about defining what abundance isn't. Because it is not just an omnidirectional moreness. It is not just building anything, and nor is it a technocratic, modest, minor cutting of a couple pieces of red tape here and there. Abundance is about defining a state of the future, about defining the things we think we need to have enough of to give people a foundation on which to build the flourishing lives we want to see for them. There are things that are obvious for that. Housing, which has been mired in a state of scarcity in the places people most need to and want to live. Clean energy, where our goal should be clean energy abundance, not just decarbonization. Government that can accomplish the goals it sets out to accomplish. Government that when it says, we will do this for you, that thing gets done on a time frame you can actually feel, and at a budget we can actually afford. The kind of, this one is harder to find, but is no less important, the sort of ferment of science and technology. And then I think you could expand it in other places, the immigration system that is both humane and serves American interests, an education system that prepares us for a future that is increasingly uncertain. There is a sort of flood in right now, I feel like, of people demanding the abundance mantle for goals that I don't share. Sometimes it gets called dark abundance. There's also an effort to do very sharp line drawing. Well, there's the populist and there's the abundance side. Um, I don't see those things as incompatible or even contradictory. But I do see there as being in all these places real definitional work to be done. And a lot more work, like what has all the energy and abundance is the critique of how government is currently run, which is important. I think that's the most actionable part of it, and in some ways the most politically potent part of it. I think to become the kind of party that can win elections and operate credibly, the Democratic Party needs to be more than the party that tells you why Republicans are bad. It needs to understand the way it has failed you. At the same time, being able to describe a future in a way people can feel it and imagine it, and then you can work backward in a very relentless way to achieve it. That, I think, is a place we've fallen down. I think that the state of future we are describing remains a little bit opaque and vague. What does it mean to say clean energy abundance? What does it mean to have enough housing? How do we make these things tangible and mimetically energetic in the way that Build the Wall, which sort of both was an imaginable policy, but also contained in it all Donald Trump's feelings about immigrants, in the way that Medicare for All, which is like a mimetic policy that contains in it Bernie Sanders' view of society and what it should be offering and what dignity inside it would mean, in the way that in New York, free rent and free buses have become mimetic for Zoran Mamdani. How do we make the future we are describing something that can be charged with energy in the very tightened communicative containers that now dominate our politics? So
Is that
that's sort of
just a
the work
marketing?
right now.
Is that a marketing and vocabulary question or something different?
No, you actually have to know it.
Mhm.
There's people often flatter themselves by saying that my ideology, my ideas, my analyses, they're too complex. It's like the reason they don't work is that they're smart and the people are dumb. No, usually they don't work. You can't explain them because you actually have not thought your way all the way through to them. There's a quote that's attributed to Einstein. It's probably one of these fake quotes, but I like it. I used to quote it to my team back in Vox about explanation, where Einstein purportedly said, I wouldn't give a fig for the simplicity on this side of complexity, but I give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity.
Mhm.
And my view is that the absence of that simplicity right now reflects intellectual work that is not yet done. Not because it can't be done, not because we failed. It's just we have been beginning a conversation. We've been beginning an inquiry. We've been beginning a project. We are not yet at the time where it's finished. But look, if Gavin Newsom wants to run for president in 2028 and he wants to run as an abundant candidate, it can't be that he allowed more infill development exempt from CEQA. That is a good thing to do. That is not a vision, right? What stands in for the vision behind which you do a lot of things like infill development exempt from CEQA or SB 79 or whatever it might be. So there is it's fame to say that we campaign in poetry and we govern in prose. But I think to be a little bit more specific, it's that you govern in agendas, but to campaign, to inspire, to think, you have to be able to speak in terms of futures. And I do think that American politics, in many ways, has become an unending argument about our different visions and views of the past. And we have, in some way, lost the muscle of imagining a future.
Mm.
And that is part of the work here.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk a little bit about some of that. I know Kate, with her work, has some ideas on some of that. I'll just say in terms of the marketing, I'd much rather be an abundance advocate than a scarcity advocate. I mean, I'll tell you that for starters, I think that framing really has resonated. But you have, as you mentioned, received some criticism on the left. Perhaps that the abundance vision is too friendly to developer interests or pro-corporate, that permits streamlining or deregulation, even of things we like, butts up against community interests. You wrote about this, what you called abundance's theory of power. Can you explain?
Yeah, so a little bit to our surprise, a lot of the pushback came from the populist side of the left. In our view, there is no left that can achieve its goals without some version of the abundance agenda, which actual politicians on the left understand. Zoran Mamdani has read abundance and talks about it on the campaign trail. If he wants to build his 200,000 units of public housing, he can't do it under the way New York City currently builds public housing, right? It's not possible. But there is a theory of power difference here. And I have come to take it more rather than less seriously. There are people who what they want to say is that politics is always and everywhere an us versus them, the real people versus the corrupt elite interests who are holding us back. And in the right-wing vision of that form of politics, the real people are heritage Americans, and the corrupt interests are cosmopolitan elite liberals, the media. You can sort of name immigrants, George Soros. This is kind of canon for right-wing populism. Left-wing populism is different. Left-wing populism says that there's a real people, and then there are the corporations and the billionaires. And if we could just break their power, everything would be okay. That might be a strong campaigning politics. I'm not here to tell you that saying the billionaires are standing in your way isn't a good campaign line. It is. And sometimes it's true. But it is important not to believe an overly simplified theory of power. The reason the housing markets in Austin respond to new demand and the housing markets in Boston and San Francisco and Los Angeles don't is not because Texas solved the problem of corporate power and oligarchy and California has let it run rampant. Abundance has a fundamentally liberal theory of power, which is to say that wherever power pools, it can be ill-used. Whether that is in corporate power and billionaire power, it will be ill-used. Sometimes that is union power or environmentalist power. Sometimes that's local NIMBYs. And that's not to say any of those groups are categorically bad. A thing that I push against, a thing that is alien to my politics, is the idea of a categorical bad. That there are always shifting alliances and interests. When I cover how to build energy transmission pipelines to bring all this clean energy we're generating in one place to the places we need it, there are corporations on both sides of that fight. When I cover housing, sometimes the developers are a huge ally, sometimes not. Sometimes the same people who are NIMBYs on one issue are enthusiastic proponents of solar on another. That I differentiate abundance. Abundance liberalism is a goal-oriented rather than a process-oriented liberalism. Process, in my view, favors the powerful, favors the people who can pay off lobbyists, favors the people who can send lawyers to the meetings, favors the people who are already homeowners in a place and know when the meetings are and have the time to attend them, as opposed to the family working 3 jobs who wants to move there to be nearer to where they work and have 3 kids and don't even know there's a planning council meeting to build an affordable housing development they would one day, maybe if it happened, live in. Abundance theory of power is liberal. You are constantly balancing the different power centers in society against each other. And the only way to know how to do that balancing, the only way to know who is on your side in this fight, is to know what you're trying to achieve. And then literally, if they are on your side and not. And if they're on your side today, they may not be on your side tomorrow. I get asked constantly, like, is abundant anti-corporate? I'll say it's not pro or anti-corporate. You tell me where the corporation is, and I'll tell you how I feel about them. Is it pro or anti-union? I am emotionally pro-unions. I've been a union member many times in my life. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you unions are institutions that never make decisions that I disagree with. Is it pro or anti-government? I understand it as a fundamentally pro-government agenda. I'm trying to make a state capable of delivering on its goals. But in order to do that, I have to viciously criticize how government currently works. And there are plenty of people in government who are happy with how it currently works, who do not want to see it change, who are used to what it is now and do not want it measured by its performance rather than by their seniority. Liberalism, I think, is a tough ideology in that it doesn't offer you simple and unchanging answers. It doesn't cleave politics into the good guys and the bad guys and make sure you're a good guy. And so in that way, I do think there's something to those who reject it, because I think that people trying to get things done often have very good and nuanced views on abundance. But the people who just want to see politics split into us and them, this is not their politics. And I've come to believe them when they tell me that.
Sharif is a mediator and does collaboration, for a living, and that's what I do too as a mediator, and trying to find common interests and focus folks on those interests as opposed to the positions is one of the tools that we get. But this also relates, and you touched on this in your beginning, to why we're polarized. Just quickly, you've already said a little bit. Is there more you wanted to add about common threads of the 2 books?
Sure. This is actually getting at work I'm going to start doing, but the project that I am involved in some ways right now, that'll be my project for the next year or 2, is about thinking about liberalism, which I think has become a very exhausted both ideology and identity. And I think that I'm not sure how relevant this is to the topic of this panel, but you asked. I've been thinking about why liberalism has fallen so short. And I think you can boil that down to 2 things. Liberalism became a political movement that didn't deliver. And liberals became people who didn't like you. And both sides of that have been poisoned. So you can see my first 2 books, both of them, as about why don't we deliver in the way we promise we promise you that we will during campaigns. And why we're polarized is about why it has become so difficult to deliver under conditions of polarized governance. You are, Barack Obama with 59 senators, but you're facing the filibuster. Or you're Barack Obama later, facing Speaker Paul Ryan. And then abundance is about why we don't deliver when we cannot blame it on the other side, when it's not Republicans. But then there's this other side of things, which is that liberals became people who didn't like you. As part of Abundance, I've been on what feels like an unending media tour and going on many of the podcasts where, liberals lament we lost, this generation of young men. And what these podcasters, many of them comedians and other kinds of cultural figures, say to me, both on and off air, they don't talk to me about what Trump did or Obama did or Biden did. They talk to me about how it felt to be pushed to the sides, how it felt to be told they were bad now, that what they thought was bad now. This sort of cultural fear, does that, in my view, excuse welcoming in a much more again, from my politics, dangerous ideology, which is using the tools of the state to police speech in ways that liberals never even imagined doing. No. Is it part of how those people won power? Absolutely. And so the way my books connect and the way my work connects is I think I am trying to ask repeatedly this question of why have we failed you? My view is not that I don't blame voters for their decisions. Voters make decisions that make sense from where they are. But if I think that I am part of a political movement that is better for them, then a really good question is why are they so disappointed in me and the people who I know and talk to? Why have we failed you? Why have we failed you politically in terms of when we hold power? And why have we failed to make you feel like you have a place with us, even if you don't agree with us, right? Why have we failed to make it feel like we're all part of an experiment together, as opposed to we are eager? And I think this really became dominant, and I think social media had a lot to do with it, call 2016, 2017, 2015 to 2021 or 2022. I think it really changed the way liberalism communicated. And so I think that part of the political theory of abundance, which is all saying, yeah, we are going to come down from this perspective where we're the smart, credentialed people with all the answers. Just give us power and trust us. And if you're not smart enough or good-hearted enough to know that we are the better people, well, shame on you. Like every part of that was wrong. The idea that we were so good at wielding power was wrong. The idea that people should feel so great about what we've done is we're driving them out of the places in which we govern because they can't afford to live here anymore while we have our lawn signs about how no human being is illegal and kindness is everything, and Black Lives Matter, as the Black residency of San Francisco drops in census after census after census. And that last part, the shame on you. How dare you not see that we're the good people? So I think my big project is trying to build a liberalism that takes seriously its own failure so it is capable of competing in what has become a much higher stakes political competition.
I think some of the dispute resolution tools in having people feel heard, listening, even where we can't agree. I know Sharif's going to touch on those. Before we go on to Kate and Sharif, just two other quick questions. Ezra, there's a lot of lawyers on this webcast. I'm recording this at a law firm, proud of its environmental and social governance and municipal law practice. On the other hand, abundance says we have in modern liberalism with a focus on process and rules over outcomes. It says in the book we have a lawyer problem. But yet right now, the demand for due process, the need for lawyers, actually seems to be one of the key remaining tools for those that want to resist the activities of the current federal administration. Is there a way to reconcile that?
I don't think they're in opposition. In an early draft of Abundance, there was a story that I ultimately took out because it's hard to talk in the first person in a co-written book of me going to the home that Gideon and his, I don't even think then wife, but maybe wife, shared, and talking to them while I was still in college about whether or not I should go to law school.
Right.
And my parents wanted me to go to law school, but I was already a political blogger. And
How will you
my
ever
parents,
make a good living as a journalist?
yeah, and my parents kept saying, "Well, then if you'd have something to fall back on at least." And Gideon and Misty saying to me, "Well, do you want to be a lawyer?" And me saying no. And they're like, "Well, then you shouldn't go to law school." Best advice I've ever gotten. To say that America has become a society built around complex negotiation and process, and as such needs more lawyers than in some ways is ideal, is not to say lawyers don't do good work or we don't need enough of them. To say that we should not get rid of due process is not to say is not in somehow in competition with saying we should not be overly proceduralized. Every society should have enough of the things it needs, not too much and too many. And I would say there's a great new book by Dan Wang called Breakneck, and it's about US and China. And he basically says China's become an engineering society and the US has become a lawyerly society. And he says both these things have their advantages and their disadvantages. A lawyer society creates a lot of process and voice and keeps different inches from running over you, sometimes at least. And an engineering society builds things. I have a part in the book where I talk about some work by the law professor. It's a book where many of the critiques of lawyers come from lawyers, named Nicholas Bagley, who's at the University of Michigan. He talks about the procedural fetish. And one of the things he says in that part is that the Democratic Party specifically, is a highly lawyerly institution. Before Tim Walz was the first person on a Democratic ticket since, I believe, Mondale to not go to law school. It's not how the Republican side works. There's not a reason that the Democratic Party should be so lawyerly as that. And it reflects the dominance in Ivy League universities of people going to law school, people becoming management consultants, investment bankers. These are all people in a highly complex society mediating between different interests. It is very important to do that work well. It is also important to understand they can develop a momentum and a bureaucratic logic unto itself. And so it is, I think, very, very important for us to have great lawyers doing great work. And then also for us to have creative lawyers thinking about ways that work needs to change, right? Including through mediation, as opposed to a sort of like an endless process of judicial oversight. So as I almost said in the book, I know many lawyers. I love many lawyers. And we also have to be careful about a society where, as Bagley would say, we've begun to see the legitimacy of government as its adherence to process,
Right.
as opposed to the outcomes it delivers to people. Not because there's not an argument to be made for process, and not because we don't need process, but because, as we are experiencing right now all around us, actual normal people understand the legitimacy of government and their society and whether or not it delivers for them. And if process becomes the point and delivery becomes not just secondary, but absent, they will very soon turn to people like strongmen, like Elon Musk and Doge, who will burn all the process down, who will destroy the things that we should have preserved. And so having, as I was saying about liberalism, institutions capable of self-correcting and balancing is very, very, very important.
Yeah. What a great summary of really what abundance is all about. Let me, if I can now, for a few minutes, transition to Kate. Good afternoon, Kate. I know you're battling a little bit of a sore throat. What I really want to focus is, how abundance really is taking root in California, and some of the work that you're doing, which I do think is quite abundance focused. But first, let's ask that same question about your personal relationship to California and how it led you to become the CEO of California Forward.
Thanks so much, Gideon. Hoping my voice holds out for a while here. It's great to be here. Honored to be here with Ezra. So I'm also a Californian, sort of. I grew up half here in the South Bay, part of the Bay Area, and half in Wisconsin. I was the product of a very 1970s divorce agreement, which could have used some mediation, to be honest. But I ended up switching schools every semester between the two states, so that was fun. But ended up here for most of my adult life, and my kids I married a multi-generational Californian who I met at UC Berkeley. In law school, I am a lawyer and a planner. And my kids are firmly Californian here in the public schools and very entrenched. And I commuted while I was in the Biden administration. Actually, I spent kind of 1 week on, 1 week off between here and DC. When I came back, I wanted to take on the challenge of really helping California, which, as we all know, because the governor says it every 5 minutes, is the fourth largest economy in the world, become a true model of how to walk the walk of building this kind of economy we keep talking about, that's sustainable and it's resilient and it's inclusive and it provides opportunities. And if we can't do that in California as a sort of self-styled climate leader and leader on kind of inclusive growth, then we can't keep talking about it. So I really wanted to come back and sort of be in a position where I could work on that.
Yeah. Abundance, and Ezra himself were widely cited as breathing life into California Environmental Quality Act reform. Ezra's idea, which he's just discussed, is that if you believe in government, you have to make it work. And it appeared that the book did help sort of give that final dispositive push to getting that reform. Can you discuss how Assemblymember Wicks's from the East Bay AB 130 and Senator Wiener from here in San Francisco's SB 131 went down, and some details on the provisions, and I guess more fundamentally, whether you think it is going to make a difference on housing supply in our state?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me give a little context first. And you said this at the beginning, but just again, when I was in the governor's office working with Governor Newsom in his first term, I was the head of what was then called the Office of Planning and Research. It's actually now called the Land Use and Climate Innovation Office. I think it's an office within the governor's office. And it's the part of the California government that writes CEQA guidelines, the California Environmental Quality Act guidelines, maintains the database of all the lawsuits, also focuses on long-range planning, which and ends up kind of being the place where housing, transportation, land use, climate, and a bunch of economic growth stuff come together in terms of the governor's vision and interagency coordination. So the CEQA wars are super familiar to me. I've spent a lot of time in that space. This current reform bill signed by the governor was really the result, as you said, of two separate bills, one in the Assembly, one in the Senate, which is super important. But it came out of years of conversation, including from our office and the office before me under the Brown administration, about the fact that CEQA had sort of become the default answer to every question in California about land use decision making. And so this is a very California approach. We, as a state, have been blessed by this incredible economic growth, a lot of it by accident. We sort of discovered gold, we discovered oil, we're on the Pacific Theater, so we have this defense investment. The defense investment leads to all this investment in what becomes the internet. Many other states are much more proactive about their economic growth. They're having to find it all the time to attract companies, to really be intentional. We haven't really had to be in the same way. And so I think as a result, we've been, instead of proactive, we've been very reactive to the economic growth. We spend a lot of time regulating it to make sure that the worst outcomes don't happen. So kind of a historic example, of course, is the offshore oil spills off of Santa Barbara, which are, widely cited as one of the precursors to a lot of current environmental law reacting to the smog in LA and air quality law. So we've stopped the worst outcomes through regulation and built up this incredibly strong regulatory framework in the state, which is super important when it comes to those harms, right? I mean, the oil spills, runaway sprawl, other bad outcomes, the air quality outcomes. But I think as a result, that regulation has become increasingly applied to every possible land use decision as the sort of default way we manage land use decisions and fundamentally housing decisions, transportation decisions, economic growth decisions, even when those decisions are clearly good for the broader goals of energy transition, of climate resilience, of building out a more inclusive economy. And getting our heads around development and growth being a good thing for the climate and the environment in some cases has taken years. It's taken us a really long time to get there. I definitely think the abundance frame and the book and the conversation around it has been incredibly helpful, along with kind of the reality that it happened at the same time as these increasing concerns across the state about affordability, electricity affordability, gas affordability, rising costs, but also both rising costs and the decreased ability for people to pay those costs because people are not making the kind of money they need to live in California because we have this extreme inequality in California. So that sort of moment in time of the framework, which was, I think, very compelling, and these very politically difficult issues of affordability kind of all came together to push the bills over the finish line. And this is sort of what happens in policy, as I think we all know, is it you spend years and years trying to figure out the nuts and bolts of something, and then you have a moment when it can happen because of a bunch of confluence of factors.
Right. Yeah, Ezra notes in abundance that it's as easy to obstruct a fossil fuel oil refinery, as it is a wind farm. So it's a little bit of prioritization. And I know that we're ending the legislative session right now, and we'll see if abundance keeps some momentum on energy permit streamlining and some other things that are still active before the legislature closes on Friday. Kate, can you talk a little bit? Ezra spoke, and Sharif's going to speak to this too, that, people like to feel heard. It reduces polarization, helps us get things done. Can you talk about your work in the Department of Energy and also in Governor Newsom's office on community benefits agreements and project implementation? how do we reduce polarization and create sort of the political will, project support, locally on the ground where a lot of these renewable energy projects are needed. And I know that Cal Forward does a lot of that work too.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I learned I'd done a bunch of time in think tanks, including in DC, before going into the governor's office. And then I spent these 5 years in public service. And what I really learned, the hard way in public service in California and in the Biden administration is that this is basically all trade-offs. Like every one of these conversations is about trade-offs. There are no pure solutions. There are a ton of trade-offs and a ton of discussion about how to get to them. California, I think, one thing that was really clear to me in the governor's office, and it was relevant to how we address this in the Biden administration, just that there's a lot of competing uses for things. So people often point to Texas as sort of like, here's where people get things done quickly and well, and they're building all this energy and they're doing it fast. Texas has a huge amount of flat, privately owned land that is available to be leased. And California has incredibly contested land. Like every acre is, if it's not public, so most of it is public, it's owned by the federal government or the state, but every acre is it high value agriculture, or is it a forest, or is it a place to put a large solar array, or is it needed to preserve wetlands so you don't get flooded, or do you need it as a buffer for wildfires? It's super, super contested. So I think that's just important that you come into you have to come into the context of the place you're in. And California looks really different than a lot of other states. It's big. It has a ton of opportunity, but it also has all these contested uses and contested things. And so one thing that I think I really felt when I was in the governor's office was we didn't have, and I think Ezra might agree with me on this, we just didn't have the vision and the implementation at the level of the state to figure out how to balance those things, to set those priorities, to be consistent about them. We had all these different pieces of the government doing all these different priorities in a vacuum. And then everybody defaults to the regulatory agencies because they're the strongest at the end of the day. But we just didn't have that kind of coherent approach. And a fascinating thing about California, many people don't know, is that while many states do a lot of what I just talked about, this balancing act of where's the growth, how do we balance it against these other priorities? They do that in like their state economic development agency, their state planning agency. We don't actually have either a state economic development agency or a state planning agency in California. We have arms of the governor's office that are inherently political to do those things. It's like saying, the National Economic Council is the Department of Commerce. Those are really different functions. One of them is serving the current administration in a set of ways to advance the priorities of the administration. One of them is an agency with a, congressionally confirmed secretary. So I think that's a really important point. And I'll just say a little about Department of Energy. So when I went to the Department of Energy as Secretary Granholm's senior advisor, this became a real conversation about how were we going to deploy a huge amount of money in these steel in the ground projects in a way that really worked across the country. Super diverse places, right? Super diverse projects, super diverse places. The Department of Energy, since the 70s, when it was formed, was really a research and science agency. It was doing like engineering studies, right? It was doing like very, very researchy things, mostly through the labs. And all of a sudden we got this bipartisan infrastructure law that put $62 billion of appropriations over to the Department of Energy to do steel in the ground projects, to do battery manufacturing, direct air capture, hydrogen hubs, small modular reactors. And it required this thinking about how to ensure those public dollars would be spent to create real benefit, including just making sure the developers were making smart decisions about locations and that they had a workforce where they were saying they were going to put the thing, that they're paying attention to local conditions. They have a plan for market durability. We created, while I was there, and it's a whole other webinar about this, and I do think, to Ezra's point, that there's things we could have done a lot better in this, but fundamentally, I think we created a really important structure, which was this community benefits plan structure to say, hey, we are giving out a bunch of money, billions of dollars. As we score your application, private developer, we're going to ask you your plan to answer these questions. Like, why'd you choose this site? Is there a workforce? Does it have the environmental, does it have the geography you need? Is it going to be durable? And we did that because our research and direct experience, and a lot of my experience having been in the sort of trenches in the Obama era on the green jobs work, and then throughout California, was doing engagement with communities and workers early increases project viability, decreases litigation risk, drives support for clean energy projects on the ground with folks who live in places all over the country. That grassroots support, that kind of commitment to this as a development kind of approach was missing. It's been missing. And I think it's partly what's polarized us on climate issues. And I'll just say really specifically, I was at the Center for American Progress running the Energy and Climate Program during the Obama first term of Obama and the ARA, the American Rescue and Reinvestment Act. And that, you could point to that bill as kind of abundance for clean energy. I mean, the bill drove significant amounts of money into solar installation, recognizing that a bunch of the manufacturing would happen in China and it would drive the prices down. And the goal was speed and scale, right? Speed and scale of solar. When I was in the Biden administration out in these communities trying to talk about the infrastructure bill and IRA, what I heard over and over again was, you guys sold us a bill of goods with that solar stuff. You said we'd get jobs. You said we'd get benefits. We got these huge projects. In California, we exempted them from paying property taxes. So not only did they not create a ton of jobs, they didn't create property taxes. And they didn't, share equity with the community in any significant way. And people just felt like they had not gotten anything for it. It had been imposed. I just think that is really, really important as we think about how do we do that balancing act where we're not overburdening processes in a way that creates major delay, but we're allowing for real engagement at the community level to potentially reduce delay and to build an ecosystem of support and political will for this kind of project. So people don't come out and say, we hate wind and solar. Which is sort of what's happening now. Instead, they say, oh, in my community, there is this thing. We got a bunch of local jobs. We got, dividends from the transmission line going through our community. We got an offtake agreement so that we can use the power. It's affordable and reliable power for our community. We love this stuff. I think that's super important.
Yeah, and Sharif's going to talk a little bit about how we sort of negotiate those things. One last question for you. You heard Ezra's critique of some of our climate goal setting and messaging as too much of a scarcity mindset. In California, our goal is net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045. I think most people don't even know what the hell that means. But we're far behind, and huge changes and huge technological innovation is needed. You just wrote a white paper on this that's in the materials today. Do you agree with Ezra that we need to sort of focus on different outcomes, maybe more on energy abundance versus decarbonization, or different messaging to get where we need to go?
Yeah, I mean, I do fundamentally agree with that. That white paper, I wrote with a number of folks, including former regulators and environmental justice and conservation advocates. So all of us kind of coming to this argument that California has to get past its default reliance on environmental regulation as sort of the check on all projects and carbon emissions as the metric for all projects. We need to start seeing development done well with a clear relationship to the goals, kind of our broad goals of reducing inequality and addressing climate change as the thing we're fighting for. I think that means moving away from local greenhouse gas emissions as the metric of success, especially since the primary emission of carbon stays in the local atmosphere for about 2 weeks and then it becomes global. So driving everything with this kind of false assumption that you're constraining carbon within a local area leads to these perverse outcomes where it's better for your carbon outcomes to not build anything than it is to build something, right? I think if we truly want to drive the transition from an industrial economy that's been built on fossil fuels since the beginning to one that's still industrial but decarbonized and more resilient in the face of projects, of actual climate impacts, more resilient in the face of these increased climate impacts, we have to pay attention to a new set of metrics, which is about the contribution of projects to global emissions, for instance, the economic benefits of including the tax base, not just jobs. I think jobs is a problematic metric with what's going on with AI and automation, and jobs is not the only thing that builds an economy. Building a stronger set of advocates from across economic and workforce development and health and education and housing and transportation to give this staying power as a transition. I think that's where we have to get. If we keep down this, it's all about parts per million, it's all about X emissions by Y date within the bounds of California, I just don't think that the best way to that low emissions future is frankly to offshore everything. and have no growth. And that is just not a viable option to build the fourth largest economy of the world.
Right. Yeah. And if you can get those people on board, maybe that's the momentum towards the liberalism that Ezra's thinking about for his next book. Let's transition to Sharif with the half hour or so that we have remaining. Sharif, you were born and raised in the Central Valley. Can you talk about how that has impacted you and your career trajectory?
Sure. Thank you, Gideon, for putting this panel together. It's a privilege to be here. I grew up in Fresno, and like a lot of people, I fell into this line of work. My mom is on the call, and our family would go on a birthday hike to Millerton Lake, which, for those who know, is behind Friant Dam. It's a big federal dam, and we just spent a lot of time in the Sierras and lakes and rivers. And so the connection to the work at Kearns and West is I started working at Kearns and West in the mid-90s, so I was a child prodigy. And there was this, right around that time, there's this more policy train wreck happening with the licensing of hydroelectric facilities. And it's really complicated. You've got lake levels and flows, you've got rural economies, recreation, you've got flood safety, water safety, all these decisions, they have to be good decisions. And what had happened is it was challenging because all these dams have been built in the 60s, and they were all getting new permits to operate 30 years later. In this time period, 200 dams, all the permits for these dams all expired in 1 year. And it just broke the capacity of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, of all the agencies around it, to be able to deal with these problems. And so just the sheer volume of the delays and the litigation created a situation where people really didn't need to reach agreements. And that's, having spent so much time in the Sierras and the foothills, I had a way to get into this field because I just knew about this problem kind of intuitively, and I really cared about the issues, and stay in it because it's a great field. Just being able to see people again and again and again, despite the underlying permitting problems that may exist, reach agreements. It's a great field to be in.
So let's talk about a little bit, what is the field? I do a lot of litigated case mediation where lawyers hire me. Your field is sometimes a little bit before that, during the permitting or planning stages. The technical name for the field is ECCR, Environmental Collaboration and Conflict Resolution. Your firm, Kearns and West, is one of the leaders in that. Can you spend a couple of minutes here telling us what you do, what Kearns and West does, and what is the field?
Okay. Absolutely. And I'll start my non-lawyer story, and respect, and lawyers are essential in processes. I was a file clerk at an insurance defense firm in high school for 2 years, and I decided that wasn't for me. And I should, if I'm going to talk about Kearns and West and the field, I have to start with this really important disclaimer, which is I would hate for all of the incredible lawyers and scientists and planners in the firm and the field sort of to be judged by my communication skills. So I just want to get that out of the way at the beginning. But what we do is we really work hard to help parties collaboratively move forward. And this was policies, with permits, this was projects. And as you said, there's just different labels for their work, and a lot of really great companies doing this work, and a lot of great government agencies dedicated to this work. But yeah, collaborative policy, mediation, alternative dispute resolution. It's a mission-based field. You alluded to this at the beginning, and I think it's important to repeat it, that impartiality is critical to the field. And everybody, if someone's going to get a group of people together and say, I want to work with you to reach a settlement, they deserve someone who's impartial and neutral to be helping them with that. And we don't offer political opinions. And just really quickly, one connection I want to make to the book and the idea in Ezra, your book, which I think everybody in this field should read. I think it'll help you. It helped remind us all why we got into this field, which is just these ideas of optimism. There's these ideas of being willing to set aside positions that aren't working for us, stale sometimes, kind of hating process for process sake. And I think most importantly, it's just, the idea of just not being content with this redistribution. And from my perspective, I think for a lot of people in the field, that's kind of the heart and soul of this ADR or ECCR field. There's a great reading list. I'd say we're also happy to do informational interviews if people are interested in getting into the field. Sorry, go ahead.
You heard Kate talk about community benefits in the context of green infrastructure projects. Ezra last week was on another podcast. I listened to the whole thing, Ezra. talking about some prescriptions for polarization. And he said, quote, people, and he said it today, people need to feel that you like them and that you will think about them. They want to be treated as full participants. Do you think that, collaboration in the work that you do is one of the ways that we can respond to the critics of abundance and to ensure that community voices can be heard as we think about deregulation, as we think about streamlining land use permitting?
Absolutely. Yeah, I really do. And it would be a shame. It would be a shame to not be good stewards of this optimism that's here. And the concerns of the critics, they should be addressed. And it's certainly not just land use. And I'm not hearing that the goal of what Ezra was talking about in the book is to stop working with communities. I mean, if that's the case, I'll just politely hop off this call right now. I think that the goal is to be willing to get to good decisions and be willing to move forward. And to that end, I wanted to just talk about what California has some great examples of big projects moving forward. And I wanted to share one, which is the San Joaquin River Restoration Program. And I really love this project. It started with a settlement in 2006, and it's the Natural Resources Defense Council, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the Front Water Users, and they reached a settlement to reintroduce salmon to this river. And this is after 65 years. And it's essentially a construction project, a 150-mile river restoration construction project. And last year, they had the highest number of salmon return. And this gets exactly to the point Kate was raising. The question is, why did this work? 7 years is a really fast time frame in the infrastructure world. And the reason it worked was early collaboration, I think. And that may be obvious, but there's this meaningful agreement, in this case, a settlement, that preceded the permitting process. It preceded the permitting process. And I don't need to explain for any number of reasons. NEPA is a terrible venue for collaborative problem solving. And I guess if there's like one point that I'd like to make today, it's that, if your permitting process or your legislative process or your regulatory process, that doesn't have to be your problem solving process, and in many ways shouldn't be. And so I agree with you, Kate, that if you want to address the concerns that people may have about permit streamlining, it's really important that the first time that people hear from you really isn't during and in the middle of the permitting process itself. So sooner is better.
We focus so much, as Ezra has said, there are many, many things we agree on. We have so many common interests, but in this era of polarization, we often are focusing on the areas where we disagree. Let's talk about your work and what you do, the process, some of the specifics of how you try to bring parties together. What are the skills and the mindset, Sharif, that we use to persuade when working with stakeholders or with the other side in a settlement meeting to reduce polarization? What are 2 or 3 of the skills that you want to highlight for the folks listening today?
For sure, yeah, and I'm in awe of what the work I see people doing in the field, and the work I see people doing at Kearns and West, and I mean, if I try to summarize it, I'd say like the mindset, a good word, is to say to the community, we know our project is going to create burdens for some people, and we know it's going to create benefits for other people, and we know that everyone is not going to be happy, but we're going to work with you to work to balance those out to the best of our ability. And I think if I had to try to put it in one or a few sentences, that's what I'd say. And this is simple, but simple is important, that building trust is the foundation of everything in this work. And one of the things I really do like in Ezra's book is if you read it, there's no disrespect anywhere in that book for opposing views, or I couldn't find it. And it's very respectful of opposing views, and that's critical. My colleague at Kearns and West, Jamie Damon, suggested a great study on cross-sector collaboration in cities. It's a fantastic resource that it provides step-by-step ways and techniques for building trust in the context of cities. And I can give you an example, or would you like to move on? I want to be respectful of time here.
Yeah, well, there are techniques for reducing reactivity, even if it's interpersonal relationships, mirroring, labeling, trying to get reassurance of people. These are techniques that a lot of mediators use. Another one is, once you build that rapport, to spend the time talking about alternatives, okay? Our job as mediators, our job in settlement discussions is to try to bring choices to the parties, to go through a process, hopefully not too long. Hopefully that's not going to slow things down, Ezra, but at the end gets both parties in a position where they are comfortable to provide real choices to the other side. And then the ability to review those choices versus the alternatives. What's your best alternative? What's your worst alternative? And then again, try to bring the parties back to, we do have common interests. There are things about these projects, there's things about the abundance mindset that are good. There are common interests that we share. These are some of the techniques that I use as a mediator to try to build some bridges and resolve these disputes. One last question before we open this up for 20 minutes of some back and forth, Sharif. Ezra does talk about bottlenecks in abundance, and mentions that many times negotiation is actually a big source of our problem, not always the solution. For example, with high-speed rail, he writes, "What has taken so long is not hammering nails or concrete, it's negotiating. Negotiating with courts, with funders, with business owners, with homeowners, with farm owners. These are all the people you work with, Sharif. So how do we build capacity to resolve issues quickly and get to the outcomes that Ezra writes about? Are there best practices or best processes that give space for negotiation, but also ensure that it's productive and efficient?" What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think we're talking a lot about permit streamlining, and I think that's coming up a lot, and coming up a lot, and trust in that is really important. But in terms of this idea of, are things taking too long? Are there processes that aren't working? If you just look, for sure across our projects across the country and many places across California. I was talking to my colleague here at Kearns, Mike Hardy, about the skepticism about starting into a process. And he said we need to acknowledge that this can be true. And oftentimes, if there's these kinds of deadlocks that are happening over and over again, it's because the policy framework is wrong, or because the public sector, they don't have the tools they need, or they don't have the capacity to make the decisions that they need to make. And they don't want to make the wrong decisions. You don't want to release the wrong amount of water that is going to destroy or erode levees downstream. So you have to make good decisions. And I remember those dams, those 100 dams that were falling into this really troublesome permitting process. I mean, I can share the response to that, which is that started with a traditional licensing process, and it was a sequential adversarial process, and that failed, and that created that crisis. And the response to that was a very aspirational collaborative licensing process, and you would think that as a collaboration firm we'd be supportive of that, but that also failed too. And the reason it failed is it only worked when people wanted to reach settlements. And you just sort of can't run a government that way. You can't have infrastructure being deployed that way. And what happened was the nonprofits involved who were active in the space, the energy companies and the agencies, they got together collaboratively, and they decided to look at what had worked in the collaborative processes and the settlements that had worked. And then they developed a specific permitting streamlining proposal together as a group and submitted it to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And I'll just go through it in a few seconds, which they called it the integrated licensing process. And it's a 5-year process. And in year 1, you start the process. There's scoping outside of NEPA. Stakeholders have the chance to comment on study plans. The applicant does maybe 1 or 2 field seasons of studies. By year 4, the applicant submits the license request. And in year 5, the agency completes NEPA and issues a new license. And you may be saying, wow, 5 years is a lot of time, but these are really complicated permits and had been taking 10 or 15 years. And different infrastructure types may have different timeframes. But I think the important thing is that if you set out a process where there's an opportunity for agreement, and if that doesn't work, there's also the basis for a timely and good decision by the government. That's kind of one way to balance this problem of how do we move forward, but how do we also not be steamrolling?
Yeah, and that's what I think I'm looking for also in some of the reforms that we're seeing, the abundance-related reforms for energy permitting. housing, et cetera, in our state. So, Ezra, you had a chance to listen to Kate talk a little bit about her work and community benefits agreements, the Bind administration, and what they were trying to do, and Sharif as well about sort of the role and best practices and collaboration and mediation and how that might relate to reducing polarization. Anything that you want to say in response to what we've heard so far?
Yeah, I think the way I would think about a lot of things is that we thought about calling the book The Abundance Agenda. And one reason we decided not to is we decided not to create an agenda.
Right. You mentioned that in the book. Yeah.
Not like a 75,000 bullet pointed list. And the reason is that as we did this work and thought about the ineradicable specificity of the different questions that were being raised here, it is different to cite a large solar development, excuse me, in the middle of downtown Los Angeles than in the flatlands of Arizona, right? It is different to build what it would mean to build a 14-story apartment complex in Truckee than in San Francisco. There isn't a one size fits all. The thing that I think we need to be better at is being experimental and admitting when the thing we're doing is also not fitting. So I'm not going to sit here from my table with much less domain expertise than others on the call or others in the audience or the whole world. And so yeah, that sounds great. Or no, that's too long. It should be 360 days, not 180 days. Or 5 years is too long. It should be 3.5 years. What are our goals? What are we trying to achieve? What is the measure by which we know if we are succeeding or failing? And if we are failing, what do we do about it? That to me is a set of questions. Abundance is not an answer. It is a more generative set of questions, and it is an orientation towards taking those questions seriously, even when they tell us uncomfortable things. So to the extent what we are attempting to do, I think a lot, for instance, about high-speed rail. And the reason or one of the main reasons we started high-speed rail in the Central Valley where we started it is because the federal money was granted through a federal program that was not just looking to build high-speed rail, it was looking to reduce air pollution in marginalized communities. And the strongest case for doing that was in some of the communities in the Central Valley. But one of the downsides of that is that the Central Valley is a place where if you build high-speed rail, you've generated the least political momentum to finish it. So the extent high-speed rail is trying to improve transportation and reduce air pollution for people all across the state. If you don't finish it, you didn't achieve that at all. It didn't matter what your process got. It didn't matter what motivated your process. It mattered what the outcome of your process was. So to me, there isn't one process. There is not one process, one approach, one basket of statutory language to rule them all. We have to know what we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve it. And then we have to weigh that against whether or not what we are doing is getting us the outcomes we seek. And the political movement that I want to be part of, the political movement that I would respect, is the one that is just rigorous about doing that. And so for all these things, we all have ideas, and they will be different in different places, different for different projects. What it means to build housing is different than the problems of building transmission lines, which are different, by the way, than the problems of trying to get Medicare prescription drug negotiations such that the new prices are there in 1 year as opposed to 3 years. But what should unite them all is like a relentless belief that we are here to serve the people we're here to serve. In many cases, the people who we think these processes are there to aid are not being aided. Now, as Sharif says, it would be insane. It would be insane and immoral to say the way the government should work is to act without consultation. Processes, among other things, an effort to generate information, and the society is much too complex for the state to act without generating that information. But you have to know, and you have to be serious about whether are you generating information that then goes to some decision-making body or individual who can then make a good decision and move forward, or are you generating paralysis Or have you created spaces for bureaucracy where just moneyed interests want to come in and stop things? And it's that sort of balances. So I can't come here and give any of you a yes, that's the way, and no, that's not the way. We're going to have to try things. We're going to have a little bit more. This is throwing back to an older liberalism, the FDR liberalism. Huge swaths of the New Deal were a disaster. They didn't work. So we stopped doing them. We did other things. Knowing what you're trying to achieve and then being able to be honest when you aren't or not achieving it, like that to me is the most important orientation in all of this.
Well, if nothing else, I mean, abundance certainly has created an enormous amount of discussion around this topic, but I do think, any honest assessment is that it has created momentum towards some common vision of the outcomes that we want, that the liberalism wants. And if you can build that momentum and sort of that foundation that this is what we're going to, maybe it is going to make those micro decisions, those decisions on process, which ones we keep, which ones we don't keep, easier. So this does relate to the California governor's race. Abundance is already being talked about by the candidates. Affordability is, not decarbonization is the word on the candidates' tongues. Anybody want to talk about the California governor's race and how some of these concepts are influencing what we're hearing from the candidates? The elections next year.
I say something about high-speed rail first, though.
Sure.
Just really briefly, I really appreciate what Ezra said about having the goals. I do think it's important just to remind ourselves that the goal of high-speed rail was never just connecting San Francisco to LA. It really was also connecting Merced to Fresno, to Bakersfield, to Turlock, to Modesto. And part of why that is because those are the fastest growing parts of California. They are growing fast. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of potential for kind of unchecked development in those places with a lot of sprawl and decisions that are being made that are not particularly great for the outcomes of those cities. And I think a lot about this. I spend a lot of time on the current train that goes through all those cities, the San Joaquin's line of the Amtrak. It's always full. There are always people going in between those cities. People use that rail all the time to go between those cities. And I think that's really important because building high-speed rail doesn't just get people from A to B. It creates stations that become economic drivers. In Bakersfield, which is kind of ground zero of the oil and gas transition, it's one of the places that's probably going to do that transition first from an economy built on oil and gas to a new kind of economy. I actually think it's really important to offer kind of economic opportunity. So just wanted to say that not going down Highway 5 would have been easier and faster, but it wouldn't have stopped in any of those places and picked up passengers and built economies. And I think that's just important. Do I think that it should have been done better from the outset? Yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that creating a new bureaucracy wasn't the way to get it done. Early planning and actual centralized authority, kind of like what we were talking about with transmission. This is a big thing that goes through a lot of places. And there's a state interest in it that goes beyond the individual interests of the places. You do need to have a vision. You do need to figure out how to affect that vision. But I just think that kind of the Central Valley was very important to it. And
I think that's fair. You just have to build the rail.
I agree. Oh, I agree with that.
I mean, this is the whole thing,
yeah.
right? Like we get very caught up, I think, sometimes on these. There are a lot of good values you can pile into a project. But if you fail, then you have to say what we did was fail, right? We got something profoundly wrong. And they don't have money to build that. They don't have money to finish it. It's not connecting anybody. At best, maybe at some point you get this this train that won't support itself. I push in on this because like I do think it's it's like a line I always want to draw. Good intentions do not we have to be so careful about justifying bad outcomes on good intentions. Right? If what we had was a train that was $7 billion over budget, I'd be fine with it. Maybe we can get the cost down a little bit on the next one, but what we have is no train.
I totally agree with that. And again, some of what I think is going on with that story and what I said earlier in general is that California's got this kind of lack of planning at any central level. And so you end up with all these kind of super fragmented processes. And one of the reasons I brought this up, Gideon, to your question, was that the governor's race, we're doing a candidate forum at our big summit this year. We need to talk about this question to the next governor. What is the plan on these big issues that are facing California around affordability, around income inequality. We're the second most inequitable state after Louisiana right now. What are we going to do about addressing these questions of like what kind of economy we want to build? Because the era of our sort of magically finding things is not here anymore. We're having our lunch eaten by not only China but neighboring states on a lot of clean energy development and a lot of kind of the emerging opportunities in the economy. So I think we do have to ask these questions, and part of asking these questions is about exactly what we're just talking about, which is what's the plan and how are you going to actually do it? How are you going to have a plan and then implement a plan from the governor's office, and what does that look like in reality, in operation? It can't just look like continuing to discover things and hoping it all works out.
Yeah, so we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to just try to squeeze in, if I can, sort of two questions here. Ezra, you say we're in a messy interregnum, a molten moment where old institutions are failing. What a great line, by the way. And you talk about dark abundance. We're seeing the pushback to the Trump administration. What you don't envision is more fossil abundance. In very quickly, I was reading a book, Rick Perlstein's book, Reaganland, which I think you recommended to me, Ezra, 1976. It's post-Watergate. Ford has just lost. Reagan is seen as insufficiently supportive of Ford. The Democrats have both houses and a new energy with Jimmy Carter. People are saying the Republican Party is dead. 4 years later, Carter's gone and Reagan wins in a landslide. Are we just in the pendulums of history now, or is something different this time and we're at the end of history? What do you think of that, Ezra, just for a second?
I just don't think history is a pendulum, and nor is it a straight line. There is no better way to look like a fool in a decade than to say that a decade from now will be a perfect extrapolation of the lines a decade from where we are, right? Go back and read the emerging Democratic majority literature from 2012 and see how that worked out for everybody.
Right.
At the same time, you can't trust that history is a pendulum, and that because the fact that you're on the bottom now means you'll be on the top soon. The Soviet Union lasted as a truly quite horrifying structure for a long time. Then the pendulum swung to democracy briefly, and now we have Putinism. Society is something we craft, we create, we fight over, hopefully peacefully. Although, as we've been talking here, there's been news of a attempted assassination of Charlie Kirk, the right-wing activist. And the idea that we can trust that the arc will bend or swing back towards justice, or even in some direction that we understand as within the boundaries of society 15 or 25 years ago, I think that's a thing to let go of too. Like, it will be what we make of it. And I think it is a very dangerous thing to trust teleology, right? To trust trend or to trust teleology. History does not just move forward from here, and nor does it have some axis upon which it rotates smoothly. And as such, all of us here who are engaged at every level need to see ourselves as nodes of, we are nodes making what will one day be called history, but it is not guaranteed to us.
Yeah. Well, that's why you're here, Ezra. I mean, writing abundance. It's easy to be a bit demoralized these days. You've talked about the Myrna vaccines and Operation Warp Speed. We're going in a different direction. We've talked about the immigration talent pipeline to our country, which now is going in a different direction, it seems. The Trump administration is pulling funding for a lot of Sharif's clients and attacking diversity, equity, and inclusion. What you wrote at the end of Abundance, Ezra, and I'm wondering if this is what drives you toward your work, Ezra. Is it fulfillment from waking up every day and using your intellect and now your platform to try to make sense of the world? Is it that work each and every day that keeps you from being demoralized?
Who said I'm not demoralized? Like, I think if you're not demoralized, you're not paying attention. Look, I appreciate the question, and obviously, you are family and think, I hope well of me. But this is my job. Like, we all have our jobs. There are a lot of days I don't want to get up and do this and don't want to think about what is happening in the world. And there are values driving me. I want to create, I want to be part of creating a better shape to history than the one that I fear we will have. But no, I don't get I never answer questions about hope. Like, I don't get up and feel hopeful. I don't get up with some burning sense of optimism. I have, I'm now old enough to have lived through better periods in politics and worse ones. But our grandfather used to have a joke, and I now quote it all the time. And I've checked inside the family that the joke is true the way I remember it. But a guy goes to the doctor. It's the only joke of Lenny's I remember. A guy goes to the doctor and says, "Doctor, you got to help me. Like, I'm sick. My wife left me. I lost my job. I don't know what to do." And the doctor says, "Well, smile. These things can't get worse." So the guy smiled, and then they got worse. Right now, the job is to keep it from getting worse.
Good.
And that means taking seriously our own role in letting it get here. And I do find there to be, like, my consolation to bad periods is that I can try to be useful. That's all I can do. I don't control anything, but I can try to be useful. So can all of us. If you're on this call, you can try to be useful in your way at your level. And you never know, like, everything is generative, right? Everything is like a little ripple that is going to create something else for someone else. We write abundance not knowing what other people are going to do with it. Maybe they'll do things with it we never anticipated. Maybe not even things we liked. Already they're doing things with it we don't like, but others are doing things with it we had never even hoped that are amazing. Maybe it creates a renaissance in Canada or Australia. So, all we can do is try with what we have to put things out in the world that are useful for other people to then build on. Just like abundance is us building on the work of thousands, millions of other people.
Yeah. And that's why, I'm a mediator. It's that same spirit to try to keep trying. Katie, you want to close us out, and then I'll say a final word?
Yes, thank you, Gideon. You saw me pop on because we are at the 1:30 timeline here. So I wanted to thank everybody for attending this afternoon, and a very, very big thank you to all of our speakers today. Really appreciate your time and your insights.
ADR Services, Inc. has been your unwavering partner in alternative dispute resolution. But as the world changed, so did we. From virtual and hybrid hearings to our ongoing on-demand CLE program, ADR Services, Inc. continues to keep resolution and legal education at the forefront, woman-owned and operated from the start. There is someone for every situation. We are ADR Services, Inc.